All right, welcome everybody. This event is brought to you by Wooden Shoe Books in Philadelphia. We're an all-volunteer anarchist collective since 1976, and also brought to you by Pluto Press, who are the publishers of the book we're here to discuss today, Workers' Inquiry and Global Class Struggle, Tactics, Strategies, Objectives, which was published last year. And if you're in the Philadelphia area and you'd like to pick up a copy at Wooden Shoe, we're at 704 South Street, and we'll do 20% off. So just mention this event if you come in and want to pick up a copy of the book. Otherwise, we'll be sharing in the chat a discount code if you wanted to order the book online directly through Pluto Press. So Robert just included that in the chat. So check that out and just go to Pluto Press's website. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers. Robert Ovetz is the editor of the book Workers' Inquiry and Global Class Struggle. He is a Ph.D. and a precarious university lecturer in political science, also the author of When Workers Shot Back, Class Conflict from 1877 to 1921, and book review editor of the Journal of Labor and Society. Gifford Hartman is a member of the Global Supply Chain Study Research Group and is an adult educator, labor trainer, working class historian, and has been a rank and file militant in the ILWU and IWW. He has helped organize workshops, conferences, and trainings on international cross-sectoral working class solidarity in a dozen locations worldwide, from the Bay Area to Europe to the Pearl River Delta of China. And Jenny Chan is a contributor to the book, Workers' Inquiry and Global Class Struggle, and an assistant professor of sociology at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. She's the co-author with Mark Selden and Poon Yai of Dying for an iPhone, Apple, Foxconn, and the Lives of China's Workers. She also serves as vice president of the International Sociological Association's Research Committee on Labor Movements. Her research focuses on labor, class, and the Chinese state in an era of oligopolistic globalization. Everybody welcome Robert, Gifford, and Jenny.
Thank you, Matt, for having us. I just want to start off by thanking also Wooden Shoe Books for hosting us. And we have a nice little cozy remote virtual group of people. So we'll have some short talks about Workers' Inquiry. Jenny will be talking about her chapter in the book. And then Gifford and I are going to do a little mini workshop, Workers' Inquiry. So I hope folks can stick around for everything. And then we'll have some time for discussion. We're going to try to keep it to an hour. I just want to also start off by saying Wooden Shoe Books is the best name for a bookstore. So I just wanted to put that out there. So thank you for everything you do. I'm going to have a short little PowerPoint presentation about Workers' Inquiry. And as Matt said, I'm the author also of my first book, When Workers Shot Back, which covers a period of tumultuous US history from the 1870s and the 1920s. And if you have a chance, take a look at that book. I can't get this to work. Why is this not working? There we go. So I want to start off with something that many of us have come to realize over the last 40 years, and that is that the working class has a problem. We're getting our asses kicked. We're getting our asses kicked in so many different ways. In many countries, union density has dropped significantly and strikes are at a historical low. Unions are harnessed to neoliberal parties. And in the workplace, they only focus on wages and benefits while ignoring the issues of work and power at work. Organizing by unions has been replaced by various tactics and strategies related to advocacy, filing grievances and mobilizing and servicing the members in the contract. Even when it comes to engaging in conflict and disruption, those have been replaced by various forms of collective bargaining informed by various catchy terms of interest-based bargaining and non-zero-sum games. And the newest hot term among unions is bargaining for the common good. And yet, at the same time, these problems face us. We're seeing self-organized struggles and wildcat strikes and disruption becoming more and more widespread. Workers are engaged in diversity of tactics and strategies. So how do we deal with both of these at the same time? The crisis of the union sector and yet the emergence of self-organized workers. For example, the walkouts that are happening in Amazon warehouses in a number of countries in Europe and North America. Well, I decided that I needed to engage with this issue. And I drew from a kind of rediscovered approach that originated with Karl Marx called the Workers' Inquiry. And I put this book together and invited Jenny and a number of other people to contribute to it as a way to really kind of add the next step to a project that others had started starting in the 1950s in engaging in workers' inquiry. And I took on the challenge of a man by the name of Ed Embry, a British independent thinker and scholar who called for a global workers' inquiry. And Ed Embry famously in this issue of now defunct little journal, funky journal, if you will, Common Sense, he put this challenge to us. He said, the enemy constantly studies class composition in order to fracture it, break it, disperse it, permanently dissipate its strength. We, for our part, study class composition in order to strengthen it, consolidate it, turn it into a real basis of power. And at the same moment, we know just about fuck all. And he continued in that piece, we have to muster all available forces to work on a militant class composition study project. This too is to inform and to be the basis of possible future political organization. Before we can make politics, he famously said, we have to understand that class composition. This requires us to study it, analyze it, and do this through a process of inquiry. Hence, no politics without inquiry. And Emery's challenge really kind of was left undealt with for several decades. And only in the last less than a decade have people started to take up this strategy, if you will, of using workers' inquiry to spark and understand worker self-organization. So in putting this book together, I collected contributions by people, independent scholars, union activists, and academics like myself and Jenny, who contributed workers' inquiry into some part of working class movements in their country. And in total, the book covers workers' inquiries from 9 countries on 3 continents that compose about half the world's population. We have chapters from South Africa on contingent miners and service workers, Jenny's chapter on contingent factory workers and state responses to self-organized worker struggles. We have a chapter on contingent auto workers in India and public school teachers in Mexico, logistics warehouse workers in Italy, and their ability to overcome racist internal divisions among logistics workers, truckers and logistics workers in Argentina, my chapter on strike threats by university professors, and a chapter from Turkey on transport logistic workers. And finally, a chapter from the Notes from Below group, kind of summarizing the range of workers' inquiry that they have published on their website for gamers and platform workers and call center workers, retail workers, and cleaners. So in total, we cover a broad array of the waged work sector in these different critical sectors of the global capitalist economy. And the real objective of the book is to begin this reevaluation of tactics and strategies, something that's really been left to the side in works that are done on the labor movement and on worker struggles. We're now seeing a kind of reattention to these issues with Jane McAlevy's really valuable work and her books and her trainings. But a workers' inquiry takes a different tack than Jane McAlevy's focus on strengthening organizing for the purpose of collective bargaining. The tactics and strategies of workers' inquiries informed by what is called class composition theory. And so when we're talking about workers' inquiry, we're talking about workers' inquiry being the method for understanding the class composition, the organization of capital and the organization of workers. So there's essentially three objectives of using workers' inquiry informed by class composition theory. So the first objective is to understand what's called the technical composition of capital. The technical composition in brief is essentially capital's current strategy for imposing work. How is capital organized? How's the workplace organized? What are the means by which owners of capital organize and reorganize work in order to impose work and exploit and extract labor power from workers? How, in other words, how is work organized? What's the division of labor in the workplace? As well as other issues such as what's the management strategy around the introduction and use of technology, the wage hierarchy, excuse me, in and outsourcing, etc. There's a little spelling mistake there. Also, how does a particular workplace fit into the global supply chain? This is something Gifford and I are going to work with you on. Little modeling project that we're going to do in a little bit. So where does your work fit into the larger global supply chain? Where's your workplace and your employer fit into it? And understanding these in totality helps us understand where the linkages are, where the weak spots are in the production process, in the circulation process, so that organized workers can apply leverage at those points to disrupt production and be able to extract concessions that tip the balance of power towards workers. So that's the first objective. The second objective of workers' inquiry that's addressed, these are addressed through each of the chapters in different levels and with different emphasis, is to understand the existing composition of the working class. So in contrast to the composition of capital, there's the composition of the working class. In other words, how is the working class currently organized, and how is its current form of organization the outcome of previous strategies of capital to what we call decompose the working class. So in previous waves of class conflict, where workers were defeated, work was reorganized, the working class was broken up, reorganized, new hierarchies and divisions were implemented. So where is that starting point that we begin at in order to get to the next cycle of struggle? And from that, we look at issues of how's the working class stratified by race, gender, reproductive labor, as well as the wage, skill type, geographical location, where they have housing or not, or if they have legal documentation and status or not. And then from that, that becomes the basis for workers who are organizing to understand who they are in relationship to how capital is organized, so that they can overcome those internal divisions and recompose their power. So for workers' inquiry, it's this dynamic using class composition theory to understand capital's current composition, how the workers are decomposed, and then how the workers can recompose their power to confront capital as it currently exists. So this forces us to ask the question is, what are the current organizing tactics and strategies that workers are currently using, not necessarily just in unions, but also in self-organized struggles, like we're seeing, for example, in some of the some of the Amazon warehouses. And then the third objective is to use a workers' inquiry to identify the tactics and strategies that workers are using in order to get to that point where we can recompose our class power, not just in particular workplaces or with particular employers or even in industrial sectors, but among the working class as a whole. And so we have to ask, what are the tactics and strategies that can work under the current technical composition of capital? So understanding capital's current strategy, which is very much rooted in what I call algorithmic management, for example. We have to understand the organization of work in order to understand how we fight against it. So from that, we have to look at which workers, if they are able to recompose their power, are strategically positioned at key choke points. So if those workers get organized and in struggle, do they have the kind of leverage to apply at a choke point that then has a ripple effect on workers throughout the rest of society? So in that way, we have to look at how these kinds of struggles can be circulated. How can we learn from others' tactics and strategies in different workplaces and different locations, how they overcame those divisions and capital strategy in order to recompose themselves and what I call circulate their struggles so that we have a mass class struggle that goes beyond individual workplaces. Now, sometimes people read about workers' inquiry and they take away from it, wow, this is a great way to really get to know who our fellow workers are. And so in that way, the workers' inquiry gets reduced to just a survey. Is it just a survey? That's the question some people have about it. And the answer is definitively no, it's not just a survey. It can incorporate a survey to understand the things that I'm talking about, the capital's current strategy and the working class's current composition. But in itself, it's not just a strategy, it's not just a survey. It's not just about gathering information that informs bargaining or something like that. Workers' inquiries are not just workplace surveys, which unions commonly use, preparing for bargaining to find out what do the members really want, and then they pick the ones that are most popular, and then they proceed to bargain on them. They're also not just used in singular workplaces. They can be used in particular, unique, localized struggles, but the intention is a lot broader than that. They're also not a tool for vanguardist, salted organizing. Like, for example, we're seeing with the walkouts right now with McDonald's, where the unions are sending in salted workers who are organizing these walkouts and protests and marches as a way to try to anchor a union in particular workplaces. They're also not a structure test for bargaining, to borrow from Jane McAlevy's terminology. And Jane McAlevy, while I'm critical of her, I also think that she has some incredible ideas for how to build power in the workplace. But the end goal for Jane McAlevy is about winning at the bargaining table or winning a strike so that you get a better contract. Workers' inquiry and class composition theory is about much more than that. It's also not an academic exercise. These workers' inquiries in the book, while some of them are written by academics like myself, the intention is not just about gathering information for scientific purposes to put into a book to get cited. It's about supporting and working with others who are engaged in struggles. My own workers' inquiry looks at my own work as a contingent academic. So in this way, workers' inquiries are used for a number of different purposes. And I've talked about some of these already. To understand the current class composition, because without that information, our struggles just reproduce and replicate the same tactics and strategies that haven't really moved us forward. So we have to stop and focus on understanding how the class composition has changed over previous cycles of struggle. And that becomes necessary for analyzing and assessing capital's power and strategy, and with the objective of informing new tactics, strategies, and objectives. If we keep using the same tactics and strategies that have been used before, capital is adapting to them, like Ed Emery talked about. And if we don't adapt to how capital is adapting to those previous tactics and struggles, our struggles will continue to fail. So in this way, we can understand by looking at how capital is organized, we can understand where its weak points are and then focus on those weak points, because that's where we're going to get, if you will, the biggest bang for the buck. So thank you for listening to my short overview of workers' inquiry. I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who's going to talk about self-organized worker struggles and the relationship to the state in China. So, and then after Jenny, Gifford and I are going to do a little model workers' inquiry with you. So I hope folks will stick around.
Well, thank you so much for your brilliant talk, Robert. And you are such an incredible editor, very supportive. Well, I turned in the draft one of the chapters. And also, thank you so much for Matt for organizing the event. And I'm really honored to join Gifford. You know, if we are teaching in Hong Kong, this is the time for another break. But now I'm so sorry that I burden you that I'm going to give my presentation, hopefully to do it as quick as possible. So now I share my screen and I'm going to maximize it. And just for me to move a little bit, the icon on the table. Okay. So thank you so much. I'm going to talk about the chapter on worker organizing in China. What are the challenges, but also the opportunities. I'm going to learn and use a lot the concepts, the terms that in the book. Well, this is a very rich book. And today, because of the time limitation, we will only focus on this chapter and then the more general application of the concepts and learning more deeper about the theory. But if we focus on the national context of China, I would like to go through the very dynamic capitalist system, starting from how the older generation or the socialist working class, how they become decomposed, or what in China we will usually say the dismantling of the iron rice bowl. So it is the unmaking of the old working class. But also there is the new working class, mainly comprising the second or new generation of migrant workers from the countryside. And as we know, this is a very big context between labor and capital, and employers use many strategies to take control over labor. But I guess my reflection on workers' inquiry will be also placing it into the national political economy, or the role of the state will have to be articulated in this context. Okay, to be quicker now, I would like to give a brief introduction about myself. I understand that sometimes people say so-called academics just gather the information and then they walk away. But from myself, beginning as a university student activist to nowadays teaching in the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, I want to really work together with workers as well as many other supporters, the concerned students and scholars. We do need collective effort as well. It is not just about workers who get unionized or organized, but we as the researchers, the activists, we also need some kind of collaboration or support from each other. I am based in Hong Kong. I was born in Hong Kong, but geographically and politically, Hong Kong had been returned to our motherland since 1997. So Hong Kong is part of China. We are one of the two special administrative regions alongside with Macau. So basically nowadays, because of the infrastructure, well, construction workers of China and Hong Kong, we also contribute to build the high-speed rail. This really shortened the time, compressed the time and space, and that somehow facilitate my visit more frequently into the mainland. Of course, except nowadays during the pandemic, for 1 year and nearly half, 1 year and a half, I was also unable to move around because of compulsory quarantine. But I hope this is only temporary and it will not deter us from getting together, just like what we are doing now with the online platform. So how I'm going to structure my presentation, I want to start with my role as a researcher, or the one who conducts a workers' inquiry in China from above, but also from below. I will be referring to that in a minute. So I did undercover research in one of the biggest electronics manufacturers in the whole world. That is a Taiwanese-owned company. Whether you know it or not, I'm actually putting on the uniform. as one of the workers. However, I really didn't have the access to work on the assembly line. It might be too risky to reveal my identity as a Hong Kong citizen, as well as a university student. I was still doing my PhD then until 2014. But it doesn't really stop me from visiting them in the dormitories. I just borrow the staff card and get into the factory dormitory room. And I was really lucky that I got the friends who are also activists or organizers on the ground. So I never feel really too lonely while I did my PhD. So getting more understanding about their work routines, but more importantly, to put the supplier into the global supply chain to understand the global production network. And what I've done is also to understand the really rich social science literature, history, how we're going to understand the transition in China from state socialism to, some people say, state capitalism. And in the last 1 to 2 years, though, I start wrapping up the fieldwork I started in 2017 and 2018 in Beijing. That is actually an extension or a different take from the industrial or factory labor studies. That is about parcel express delivery. These workers, they are delivering our Amazon's parcel or Alibaba's parcels and letters. It is driven by e-commerce. And this time, I am actually one of the co-workers. Yeah, I am a female participant from Hong Kong, but I am very grateful for them. Well, many people misunderstood that I'm one of their wives or girlfriends or sisters, but depending on who they are that I pair up with. But this is really an amazing working experience. Right now in Hong Kong, it's 6 something in the early morning, and they had already started sorting the goods, getting it delivered door to door. So I'm so glad that I was one of the participant observers, and I'm going to hopefully write a funding proposal and get it bigger in the coming years. So what I've done is also to ally with Robert's call in the book to disrupt the key nodes in the global capital accumulation process. But disruption is just like one of the means to build a more equal and humane production system. So I do hope that I could combine workers' inquiry from above and below, and manufacturing is very important. China is still the global supply base, but because of the rise of the middle class and e-commerce online shopping, there had been the shift of the workers who are moving to deliver our food or deliver the parcels. So logistics labor is also getting more important. And we are in a more difficult condition right now, not only because Hong Kong had also witnessed the strengthening of national security, so-called under the national security law, and therefore the so-called cross-border organizing or the security, the sense of security we got it from Hong Kong seems to be also diminishing or under the tightened control. So I'm also going to reflect on the authoritarian regime. Our Chinese party state is still the only ruling party. It doesn't mean that unlike India or some other East Asian countries, we cannot rely on electoral politics to influence some parties to get to the side of the workers. So I hope that I would also inspire more discussions in terms of the political constraints or the high risk in terms of workers' protest or strikes in China. Given I said that we still have the high hope that we should democratize the Chinese state and strengthen the power of the working class, this is getting to be more difficult because political or economic and social stability, quote unquote, are the highest priority of the state. It does mean that some worker centers will already crack down and activists are being imprisoned. But given all these current situation, we are still doing all the best in terms of learning from you, writing about them, amplifying their voices, and strategize what we can do. To get back to the 40 years reform in China, let me briefly give you the historical context when I put down in the book. It all starts from the late 1970s or early 80s when China opened up. We have the capital from Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and the West. So this is indeed a state guide, a state-sponsored process of economic globalization. China became greatly integrated into the global capitalist economy. It is a big shift, a radical transformation from state planning to market capitalism. And we have witnessed how capital gained their power and really reform the workplace hierarchies and the systems to facilitate profit maximization. It also trigger and generate deep discontents and conflicts. So this is a very dynamic process. The state guiding the so-called economic development, not only along the coast, but also in the central and western part, which have been quite underdeveloped. And we nowadays have been seeing how Apple, Dell, or other huge companies, they are also setting up new factory bases inland. So this is also a big relocation or the rapid mobility of capital. And we have seen the retreat of the working class from politics because they no longer have their voice in the older state-owned factories. The Worker Congress and some other mechanism or structure, they had all collapsed in the transitional period during the 80s and 90s. With more competition in the market, the domestic private companies or other foreign invested enterprises, it really diversified capital. And it also means that workers are being fragmented or isolated and atomized. Workers are under-absorbed. Up to about 60 million of the state-owned factory workers will lay off. They become jobless. And some of them get the casual labor jobs from agencies, or some are depending on state benefits. So the states are actually the main influencer at this stage, not yet because of the purely market competition, but it is the state that aims to restructure its own economic system. And so these state-owned factories will structured, privatized, or going bankrupt. Many of you must have very fresh memories about what happened in June 1989 in the Tiananmen Square in Beijing. During those later half of the 1980s, public dissatisfaction, including workers, they are very angry about the fact that market, it was just chaotic. There have been official corruption, runaway inflation, affecting their everyday livelihood. And some of them are brilliant leaders. They reject marketization, privatization. They demand self-management. So just like in the 50s and 60s, even though we know that workers as the master of the state, that was always the socialist ideology, but somehow workers did have some voice in terms of their criticism section, or they can still hold their cadres accountable. But nowadays, it's quite different. The managers and directors take control, so they want to claim it back, and they are fighting for the independent unions. They are calling for freedom of association. They went on strike. However, all these protests were repressed by the state by using brutal violence and force. So there had been the collusion between the state and capital, and during the 1990s and thereafter, China deepened its reform, but without political liberalization. Not much democratic elections that have been taking place, except in some villages or at the very lowest level. So worker struggles, they basically have been all defeated by the early 2000s. To preserve its own legitimacy, though, the state still have to ensure some kind of stability. Well, stability in terms of business investment, convenience, and other preferential privileges and policies that are given to the investors. Anyhow, in the 1990s and 2000, basically 2008, there have been some efforts from the state, including the official union, to introduce new labor laws and regulations, including setting the minimum wages. And some of the reasons are actually to reduce the reliance on exports, but to stimulate domestic consumption. And there have been also some improvements in terms of rolling out the pension schemes or the very basic level of healthcare. But there are still many workers who are excluded from the state protection or safety network. So employers also ignore the laws and regulations without much penalty or punishment. There have been the massive scale of migration in China. There are nearly 300 million migrants nowadays in China. Some of them have the short-term contracts. The others are actually employed by the agencies. And even not much visible from the observers are the massive use of students from vocational schools. So they are the students from technical or vocational schools, but they are taken in under the name of internship. In fact, they are the cheaper form of contingent labor who do not have the employment contracts and who have to do assembly jobs without the connection to their disciplines or their trainings at school or in the workplace. So it is completely a bankrupt or a corrupt system that have been documented in some of other papers or publications. But to put in as a whole, managers are quite fragile, well, agile in a sense, but also fragile in another sense. Anyway, they have been trying to take control over workers by dividing them up and also to lower the production cost. We understand that after 2 decades or so, the new generation of workers, they are also having more discontents nowadays. They are not able to get back home to farm like their parents in the past, and they have been hoping to sunk their roots in the cities to get married, to have their children, to have their family. But the wages and all the long working hours, very poor working conditions, all these are also crushing their dreams. So worker grievances are quite widespread. These younger cohort of workers, some of them, they do rise up without union support. They bypass the company union to resist abuses and to call for economic rights, but also political rights. It is a process of the recomposition of the working class power. We had seen the waves of worker protests and strikes, particularly during the global financial crisis in 2008. The number of court cases going through the arbitration and other lawsuits that have been also going up. The main reasons are about economic factors, but we have also seen more recently, like the case of Jessic It is a small welding machinery factory in Shenzhen. However, these workers are actually joining hands with the university students to call for a more democratic union on the shop floor. I would like to draw your attention. It is not just about collective action, but also desperation and hopelessness. It is not always about winning, but it is also about losing. And one of the most tragic cases that I've seen in the past 10 years, and it was also part of my PhD dissertation, and later on turning into a book that was about the Foxconn suicides. In 2010, 10 years ago, 18 young workers, they commit suicide. 14 of them died. They were all between 17 and 25 years old. They are all the rural migrants. In one of the blogs on the internet, it says the use of death is simply to testify that we were ever alive at all, and that while we lived, we had only despair. And as we dug deeper for 10 years on, we wrote up the book Dying for an iPhone with my two mentors, Mark Sheldon and Punai. We map very in detail about the global supply chain, and we also draw insights from migrant labor studies to understand the possibilities and the opportunities to strike at the time when everyone is looking for a new model of an iPhone. It is the very time that is strategic for workers to get together and fight back. But still, we are in the structural constraint that the Chinese state, with its own union arm, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, that is a centralized and hierarchical system at the grassroots level. Like Foxconn, they have the union, but the union also have to report to the higher level of the state union system. And most of the time, the union chair are the managers or the senior level of management. So independent union organizing is still quite difficult, and indeed it is illegal under the trade union law. And both managers and governments, they don't want to see autonomous unions. They use every method like intimidate or harass the workers' activists to silence them. But if you cannot get the official data from China in terms of strike, then a labor NGO, the non-governmental organization in Hong Kong, China Labor Bulletin, they do compile an interactive map where we can control or define the period of investigation, the types of jobs, or the kinds of workers who get involved in these kind of strikes. And you can see all over the map, it is fire ever here and there. But still, because of internet surveillance and censorship, we may not know the whole population. But definitely, one clear message is that China workers are on strike. They get unionized, as Robert make it clear in the introduction. There are the natural leaders or the key influential core actors. Most of the time, they know each other because they are from the same province, or there are sisters or brothers or husband and wife. So there are already some kind of cooperation or connection among the workers. But as I mentioned, strikes are not protected, or unions are part of the party state. So workers can have the high risk of getting imprisoned. There are other strategies that workers and university students and some other NGO supporters, we have a more loose form of network, but also a physical form of the worker center. There have been the free of charge legal services that will be provided to the workers in needed. There have been the workshops on training them in terms of leadership skills, feminist awareness, and some of the training courses are actually dealing with collective bargaining. But sometimes we do have to do it quite low key. Otherwise, we will get the unwanted attention from the state. So these are some pictures that I took during my field work. This is the library that are open to migrant workers. There are newspapers, books, and some rooms that are for training workshops and seminars. But in these 5 years or so, because of the political tightening control under President Xi Jinping, either the social service centers are already co-opted under the government's procurement policy, or the more movement-oriented centers, they were already shut down. So now let me conclude. The topics on the interaction between the authoritarian state, labor, and capital is very complex. It is multi-layered, taking so many different turns over the past 4 decades, and definitely in the future, we will still foresee the higher level or bigger scale state repression and capitalist assault on labor. We are still trying to just find some gaps or features. There have been, it seems to us, the workers who can get organized if they remain very low key, and as long as they are not blocking the highway, there might be the kind of tolerance from the state, no matter they are unable or they just let it go, not to crack down everything, because you still need some spaces for workers to vent their anger. As long as it is not that threatening to the state control, somehow there are also space for digital communication. You know that in China, we only use WeChat. There's no Signal, no WhatsApp, not many other social media tools we can use. But states are not always having the time, 24 hours, 7 days a week to monitor everything. So some scholars say this is the worker resistance under the radar. So we will still continue to encourage to support workers' self-activity, organizing, self-organizations, new forms of organizations, and some conceptions, but toward the goal of disrupting and transcending the relations of capitalist production and reproduction. That is a very important and long-term goal. But I had also seen how actually workers have been doing work from early morning to midnight, and that means really undermining even the proper family relations at home. They become so tired, they have no time to cook. Everything is like encroaching their life world. Talking about reproduction, some of them even do not have the money and time for dating, to get married and raise their children in the city. So I'm really thankful for your patience and time. For more details, you could always refer to the book. And this is the end of my presentation. I'll go back and join you now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for that overview of your chapter. And I hope folks will be able to read Jenny's entire chapter, because it's just a phenomenal example of look at the class composition, the changing class composition in China over the last few decades. I'm going to turn it over to Gifford. Gifford is going to talk about how you can do a workers' inquiry in the workplace to identify your place in the global supply chain and identify possible choke points. I'm going to turn it over to you, Gifford.
Okay, I want to thank both Jenny for your excellent presentation, Robert for inviting me, and then for Wooden Shoe for hosting this event. Let me just jump to the presentation. My presentation came out of an experience I had with a group of railroad workers. There's 13 different craft unions on the railroads in North America and Canada and the US, and they're divided and they're weak. And they have been trying to unite in an organization called Railroad Workers United, which I've become a solidarity member, which means I'm just a volunteer. But in response to several events, the worst was probably the Chevron explosion. Now, Chevron has the biggest refinery on the West Coast, is in a city, it's a suburb of San Francisco called Richmond. There was a huge explosion in, the explosion happened in 2012. and it sent 15,000 people to the hospital with various respiratory injuries. It was a miracle nobody died. But then really the worst thing that happened was in 2013, there was a runaway train full of, it had 73 cars of fracked oil from North Dakota that was on a route to New Brunswick in Canada to refine it. And it was rolling through a town called Lac Mégantic. And there was a lot of shortcuts by the train company that ran it. And the train ran away when the worker stepped off his job to go to sleep at night. And it ran into the town and it killed 47 people. It completely fried 30 buildings. And if everyone remembers, all that frack shale coming from places like North Dakota was being sent around North America, and it was derailing because they were just running in a slipshod way, and it was super dangerous. And as a response to that, we put together a railroad conference in that city, Richmond, which also is a connection between a deep water port. It has a railroad, transcontinental terminus, and also it has a huge refinery. And so we had this conference, and it was in 2015, and we were lucky because we were able to use a community room, and we actually had 125 people attending, including 25 railroad workers. We had 25 railroad workers from across the US. But just by pure luck, there was a refinery workers strike. And that was in 2015. It started in February. It started by shutting down 11 refineries. And then by March, it had shut down another 3. So it was a total of 15 refineries were shut down. 6,500 refinery workers were on strike, and they actually had shut down 20% of the US refining capacity. Now, I walked the picket line at the refinery in another suburb nearby another refinery nearby the big Chevron one by a company called Tesoro. And when I talked to the workers striking, their issues weren't pay, their wishes weren't anything but safety, because in 1999, there was a fire at that refinery, the Tesoro, that killed 4 people, and some of the workers still remembered it. So when we put together this conference, we were lucky by having a lot of railroaders who'd been hauling that dangerous fracked shale oil from places like North Dakota. We had 9 refinery workers who were on strike at that time. We also had a native or an indigenous person from Alberta in Canada who worked in the tar fields. We also had some first responders. We had some longshore workers. So it truly was an industrial conference. We even had these 4 guys who drove 6.5 hours. They came 400 miles from the refinery in Southern California, and they were joining another 5 of the refinery workers from the neighborhood nearby. And what we did is we decided to do an energy supply chain inquiry. We had all these railroad workers, many of whom hauled not only fracked shale crude, they hauled coal, they hauled all kinds of dangerous chemicals. We had the refinery workers, and we also had, various other people, but we also had people from 30 different environmental groups and sometimes we call them fence line groups, that were right next to the dangerous refineries and were really concerned about all the dangers. We drew a map, as you see on the right side of the screen. On the left side, we went through a series of questions. We broke people up into tables and we made sure that we dispersed. There was, like I said, there was 125 people at the event. We broke it into 12 tables. We had about 10 people at each table. We tried to balance with the refinery worker at some, with a couple railroad workers at others, and with people from different communities facing the issues of living nearby a refinery, and to talk about our inquiry questions, which were about, should another strike like the one that happened at the same time at this conference, should another strike happen, how could all the workers along the energy supply chain support it in solidarity, but also how could the communities nearby take a class-based approach and also join the fight and help propel the struggle further. Now that means that the energy supply chain is not just the refinery, it's not just transportation, it's everything from extraction through refining all the way to the consumption of, petroleum products. But it also involves communities because they're in the process, and all of us in the working class are at the end of the supply chain as consumers. So we tried to make that clear. So we did this activity of an inquiry. We asked people to go through a series of questions of how to support a refinery workers strike in the various work sectors, but also in communities supporting other working class people. After the hour-long activity, we came up with results, and people came and reported back, and we actually had people report back by sector. So the railroad workers came out and they talked about their issues in supporting a strike. The extraction workers, maritime workers, knowing that the crude often is imported and comes on tanker ships, talked about issues. Truckers who, if it isn't being sent by train, it's sent by truck. Refinery workers, we talked about what their issues were, and we talked about how the strike could be propelled further. Now, if anybody remembers that period when the boom of fracking was happening across North America, there are no pipelines that cross from east to west. They only go from north to south. So if you're trying to move crude from the center, like in North Dakota to California, where we live, you have to put it in trains because there's no pipelines. So, pipelines have fewer workers. All the oil companies love pipelines because there's less workers to disrupt or go on strike. But in lieu of that, we decided that all the workers on the energy supply chain should strike in unity. So one conceptual idea, which everybody's been talking about today or tonight, is this idea of working class composition. We had to look at what are all the workers along the supply chain. So we came up with this conceptual tool. And again, we wanted, the objective of our thought experiment is to stop production. So we centered it on this case, the workplace at the center would be the refinery workers. And so in the conceptual tool, we went back downstream and we looked at, well, where does it come from? Well, we didn't go all the way to extraction, but we kind of froze it at a point and we said the chemicals, we went even beyond the fracking site and we said the chemicals have to be brought and the sand has to be brought and water has to be brought. And if anyone knows anything about fracking, each fracking well uses about 650 different chemicals. A single fracking well uses about 300 truckloads of sand. They use a lot of water, everywhere between 1.5 million gallons up to 16 million gallons of water. So even if you start thinking about how could all the workers who supply all those things, the chemicals, the sand, the water, how can they be disruptive? Well, we thought about, let's look back that far. So here we get the fracking operator. The fracking operator is probably going to put the stuff in the frac crude. Probably it's going to go into the next line, which will be a train, as we're talking about this thought experiment. And the trains have two unions. And that's the vulnerable choke point all the way along the line. Then it goes by crude, by rail to the refinery. It could also come by truck. Say the train workers go on strike, it could come by truck. It could also come by pipeline. It could also go out. It goes out normally, the petroleum products. They could also go out by rail. They could also go out by pipeline. But in this case, let's say they go out by truck. Truckers are often non-unionized, which means they don't have the protection should they go on strike. But in a lot of ways with US labor law, they have less restrictions to keep them from going on strike. So if we think about all these things, we could all begin to kind of wrap our heads around of what would a strike down an energy supply chain look like. The gas often ends at the end, goes by truck and goes to the gas station, but that's at the end of the supply chain. We're always thinking over here at the left, how could we support a strike of refinery workers even before the inputs reach the refinery? So we kind of came up with this chart where you could actually look at any workplace and you could say, here I am. So say you work at a restaurant. Well, if you go back, food, beverages, all the supplies, the cleaning supplies come from different suppliers, and they go back and they come from a fulfillment center, a distribution center, or a warehouse, and they go back to a factory, or if they're chemicals, they go back to a refinery, or they go back to wherever they go. And when they leave, it's a little different for a restaurant. What usually is the outcome, the downstream, is customers. And it's a little bit different. So we really have to, we don't want to have a consumer strike. We want to have a production strike. We want to stop the goods from going into the workplace. So we conceived this inquiry. And we have to say that one of the forms in which the working class exists is at the various nodal points along commodity chains. Now, if we're going to go on strike, we have to think, where are we? And because we have so much limited time today, I'm going to stop sharing. And I want us to think about, if you were going to strike, and if you put your workplace at the center of that conceptual chart, and you went upstream, you went to where the supplies or the commodities, or even if it's a teacher or a nurse, the people come from. And you, of course, if you work in a hospital, it's going to be PPE, it's going to be medicine, it's going to be all different kinds of things. How can you go back upstream on the supply chain, reach to those workers with this conceptual tool of a worker's inquiry? with an analysis of the power of each sector, with knowledge of if they're union, non-union, if they're confined by different labor laws. In the US, we have two main sets of labor laws. The National Labor Relations Act for most workers, except farm workers and domestics, aren't covered by any. And railway workers are covered by the Railway Labor Act, which has a lot of different sets of rules and different rules about striking. So there we've kind of set it up. So any questions? So I want to see if anyone could think about how, if you went on strike yourself, how would you use those conceptual tools to think about upstream? What comes before you? How could you reach out other workers to support your strike? And also, I think Jenny, Robert, and myself would like to take any questions or comments you have. So thank you.
Thanks, Gifford. Unfortunately, because of our time constraints, we only have 5 minutes, which is really unfortunate because I love discussion and taking questions. But so I want to open it up. If anybody has a question, you can you go into reactions and raise your hand, and or just turn your mic on, I guess.
I have a comment. My background, actually, I'm working in mutual aid and tenants unions. I'm not at a production site, but I'm beginning to wonder whether the whole collective bargaining schema is really a trap, and that in fact, like back in the day, the Wobblies or the IWW, as I understand, refused to sign contracts. So if they did not have power in the workplace to protect the workers' health, their safety, and their wages, then they had no power. So in other words, why would, if you don't do that day to day, then you don't have power. So my thoughts are, and you described like two sets of labor laws in the US. I wasn't aware of that actually, for covering railway workers are split off. And Robert had mentioned Jane McAlevey. The thing is, if we're trying to get really skilled at working collective bargaining, is it a mistake? And should we, as you indicated, go to the community, go across union lines, and go to the unorganized, treat everybody as a group to be mobilized, right? And so in other words, I guess my question, should we just stop trying to use this collective bargaining model as a box that really puts the, I mean, at 10% density, right? Is the labor movement dead, or is that just a control mechanism? So that's like an open question. And the question of going upstream would be crossing all these boundaries, turf battles, just forget it and work on common interests for working people.
Yeah, I think, Bill, you raised a great question. If we look back at some of the periods where the working class was most tumultuous, it turns out that was also the period where union density was also really low. And for example, the 1877 railroad strike or the 1896 railroad strike, working class was really weak, the organized working class. But when workers self-organized in those strikes, they targeted the structure of production and work. And by organizing themselves effectively, they were able to disrupt the trains and disrupt the economy. And from that, they demonstrated that workers could have power in that way. And it attracted workers to organize themselves and build what we call wall-to-wall industrial unions where everybody's in the union. And I think that we're at that period now where class struggle is not dead, but I think the union movement is paralyzed and moribund.
Yeah, can I answer that? So if we look at the education strikes, where did it start? West Virginia. I mean, effectively, it was an illegal strike. It was a wildcat. The state laws didn't allow that kind of strike, but then it spread to all those right-to-work states where the working class and unions are the weakest. West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, all had teacher strikes, many of which were successful. So it shows that sometimes the working class has to be mobilized, and sometimes the union holds them back, and sometimes where the unions are the weakest, the workers are the strongest.
And let's not forget Puerto Rico, where it was part of a general strike. But I think the best way to be able to distinguish between focusing on bargaining and self-organizing is, when we're strong enough, the employer comes to us. Bargaining is focused on going to the employer. And I think, we really need to reevaluate whether or not we have the power to extract concessions or not. And the one thing that the Wobblies were really effective at, and we've forgotten their lesson, is that you only get what you're powerful enough to extract. And if you're not constantly organized, then ultimately whatever you gain through bargaining is going to be taken away. And the reorganizational work will also undermine your previous power. So I think the Wobblies were onto something. And if you look at the Amazon workers, I think they're taking that lesson. They're not interested in building an institution that we call a union. They're organizing workers as a union so that they every day are making demands that they can inflict upon Amazon, even at the local plant level. And they're able to extract small gains so far, but in some other countries, they're using that and extracting even larger gains. And that in Italy, for example, has had the effect of changing national labor law. And so I think, when we start off trying to change labor law without power, we get labor law that just constrains us. When we start off by organizing ourselves, we get labor law that for a short period of time might be favorable to us, and not in the long term though. So unfortunately, I have another family commitment that I have to go to, and I have to go, unfortunately. So I think we have to end it here.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Robert. And if people do want to stay on and have a more informal conversation, we can stick around for a few more minutes. But I just wanted to thank everyone for your presentations and everyone who tuned in.
Thank you, everyone. It was great being a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Robert. I'm willing to stick around if people want to still talk. And I'd like to hear Jani's answers about maybe the situation in Hong Kong.
Yes. Well, are you asking me about the situation in Hong Kong, about like political situation or what?
Well, just
or
maybe
labor?
the labor struggle with the pandemic and also with just the latest state repression.
That's right. Very bad because media as well as higher education sectors, we basically have lots of visible or more tacit forms of control. So I am also struggling to decide the curriculum on Global China course or some other China related course. Just like in the coming June 4th gathering, the police are still undecided whether they will let people to join the vigil or in the name of national security, it would not be allowed. So yes, I just want to respond to you that there have been many restrictions and difficult considerations nowadays. And in terms of pandemic economic situation, those who are with the tourism industry, hotel, and some other retail jobs, restaurants, we hit the highest level of unemployment in the past decades. So that is terrible. And also because the union chair like Lee Cheuk-yan and some others, they are already detained. So it is also very bad in terms of union movement in Hong Kong.
Perhaps could you talk, I know at the beginning of the pandemic, there were the strikes of airline workers at the airports, and could you speak something about that? Wasn't there a call for a general strike starting with the transportation sector?
But was it about pandemic or about even 2019 when we had the anti-government protest? Because during those days, like Carol and some others who are from Cathay Pacific and some other huge airlines, they paralyzed the Hong Kong airport, the only airport in Hong Kong, for some hours, actually not that long. But already the government, the authority, the airport authority, the management, they already request for an injunction from the court. So they ally with the legal system, the judicial system, to put a ban in terms of their peaceful sit-in in the demonstration at the airport. Well, it does catch much media attention though, right? But basically, it's all very quiet over the past 1 year now because of the passage of the national security law since June last year. Yeah, it's quite bad, right? Hey, but I would like to join the previous discussions when you and Robert discussed about the union. I just also want to then broaden the discussion about student activists like USAS, United Students Against Sweatshops, or Workers' Rights Consortium, and also some other academics like Ruth Milkman and many others. They have been organizing immigrants, SEIU and some others people. So are these forces also very influential and essential, yeah, in building a broader movement or a coalition at the community level or at the workplace level and so on?
That's a good question, but it's a difficult question to answer. I think the SEIU next to the teachers unions is probably the biggest in the US with the most members. And it's kind of mixed. In some cities, it does quite well. And in other cities, I think Robert's critique of this business union, which is very top down, very much run by the staff, SEIU is one of them. So the rank and file doesn't have any power. And so most of the decisions are made by the union staff. And in a lot of places, I think that's very typical of SEIU. And a lot of the unions that, you know, what Robert defined as the business unions. But there's some unions that are less bureaucratic that do have more active rank and file. There's a union based in Chicago called the United Electrical Workers. Out here on the West Coast where I live, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union is a lot more democratic. It's actually disaffiliated from the AFL-CIO, and it actually has contracts at 29 ports on the West Coast under a master contract, which means if the workers are mistreated at one port, legally they could shut down the whole coast by all going out because they're in the same union with the same contract. So I think in the US, it's kind of, there's a different levels of strength and union activism among the rank and file that's very different in different unions. Now, Ruth Milkman talks about Los Angeles, which is a largely immigrant city. So I have a lot of hopes in places like Los Angeles because the biggest concentration of Amazon warehouses is in the logistics area called the Inland Empire, which is due east of Los Angeles that is served by railroads and roads from the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And I think that's where the future may lie, is the organizing in those warehouses that are mostly unorganized. So that's where I hope smaller unions like, I know in Chicago, the United Electrical Worker has worked as like the Republic Windows and Doors, which went on a factory occupation in 2008, was that small, more independent, more radical union. So I'm hoping that kind of organizing takes place in the logistics sector. But then there's some amazing groups also. There's a group called Amazonians United, which is a network of rank and file Amazon workers around the country. So there's a lot of different layers.
Wow, cool. Well, really excited to hear about that. How about Tim and Cal? We have two audiences right here alongside Bill. Do you have any comments, questions, or you would like to share as well? Or criticisms?
Well, I'll just say if there's no other questions, to remind everyone, if you are in Philadelphia, to come check out the Wooden Shoe, pick up your copy of the book. And if you're not in Philly, anywhere else, you can go to Pluto Press's website and order it online.
Before we